I want to start by thanking the Review of International Studies editorial team, and especially Nisha Shah, for the invitation to participate in the curation of this forum. I also want to thank Louise, Charmaine, and Neil for their generosity of ideas and for their time. Their work has definitely helped me to think more deeply about this theme, and I'm really looking forward to our exchanges. The questions that I posed for this forum are: how have design and engineering become forms of intervention rather than a means of intervention? And also, what happens when disruption rather than good governance becomes the metric of institutional success? Now, there are a few things I think we can start to unravel here. The first is, what do we mean when we talk about disruptive technologies and disruptive innovation? As a marketing and management concept, or concepts, these terms are credited to Harvard Business School professors Clayton Christensen and Joseph Bauer in an essay that they published in 1995 called Disruptive Technologies. And then also Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which was published 2 years later. Now, the play between control and chaos that informs ideas about disruptive innovation is not new. Both concepts are really born together in the early days of cybernetics, where control was only possible because of the energetic background, noise, and disruption against which control's more orderly and less entropic patterns could emerge. However, today we are finding this gospel of disruption and the notion that we've entered a new disruptive era woven into the language of solutions to almost every conceived problem imagined. Now, certainly it's become a contemporary way of describing the use of technological developments to revolutionize military operations. The United Nations Global Compact has an entire program designed around the use of disruptive technologies, including things like digital agriculture and gene editing to achieve its SDG goals. We can think of so many examples here in terms of the use of these concepts. It's almost inescapable. So of course, this begs the question, what really is being disrupted here? Is this emphasis on disruption in so many facets of social, political, and economic life merely just a marketing ploy? Does this reflect actual substantive changes in organizations of power? Are we seeing protracted forms of political violence simply trying to camouflage itself in the language of innovation? So for my intervention, I want to try to interrogate what forms of authority and legitimacy are being authorized around these visions of disruptive futures and disruptive technologies, and also what forms of statecraft are being replaced to make way for other kinds of technologies and relations that are organized around unprecedented innovation as a kind of end in and of itself. And I want to propose that perhaps we're dealing with two parallel orders here, one in which societies increasingly understand themselves in terms of risk management and are organized around unequal relations of contemporary forms of risk calculation and assessment that proliferate everyday life. And at the same time, I think we can point to many examples of engineered disruption, which can look like many different kinds of irrationalities, disintegrations, and derangements in systems. And I think that these forms of derangement, if you will, function as a necessary parallel to increasingly penetrating forms of technological control for the management of social and political risk. So what's different here? I think first, when disruptive technologies and disruptive innovation become moral goods unto themselves, the concern, of course, is the breaking up of shared social values, institutional norms and organizations, and also forms of international and civic accountability that might have previously been the markers of success, despite these institutions and forms of accountability working better for some than for others. But I think there's also the political problem of the proliferation of an ethos that submits all of social and political life to beta testing and experimental interventions, whereas I think in the past, perhaps it could be argued that these were more punctuated or could only be enacted when opportunities presented themselves to implement these kinds of political and social engineering projects. Now everything can be framed as an opportunity for disruptive intervention where sustainable or equitable outcomes don't really seem to be the point anymore. So I came to this question in earlier work on how digital technologies, and in particular things like crowdfunding and crowd mapping, were shifting our understandings and enactments of sovereignty, of security, and also the organizational and funding structures of warfare. And then during my fieldwork in the Gulf, I started thinking more about these questions in terms of the automation of police labor, remittance apps, and the securitization of labor migration, and also weather modification and terraforming in response to climate warming. And I also experimented with some of these ideas in a recent article, which is forthcoming, on the UAE's plans for Mars colonization. So here I was interested in how this project, which by all current measurements is a capital losing and fatal proposition, has become one of the Emirates' most important national branding projects in the last 10 years. And they've invested an enormous amount of resources into it. So in the article, I talk about how forms of political authority were being innovated to skip over political contradictions, environmental limits, and the precarity of a tumultuous and potentially catastrophic future caused by the feedback between peak oil and climate change, and how these forms of authority were influenced more by a kind of technologism rather than developmentalism, where unprecedented innovation is really very important to this kind of planned society. So I looked at how the project's earthbound beta tests represented a kind of increasing global vanguard relationship to the materials we call nature, combined with a world-forming narrative where the goal of politics is about making a new kind of habitat rather than the creation of a polis or deliberative society. And in many ways, I think this project reveals how the present grounds for authoritarian legitimacy are in effect kind of on loan, for which the future functions as a form of collateral for present day governance structures, which are hedged upon an engineered anticipation of a people, of a place, and most importantly, an infrastructure to come. So with regard to Louise's work, I'm very interested in her ideas about the computational madness of algorithms, which she historicizes through an engagement with Foucault and others, and demonstrates the particular pathos of algorithms being rooted in their own form of error and accident, where, as she says, unreason retains a moral dimension. So what I read in Cloud Ethics is that unreason and reason are not the measure of success with regard to the use of algorithms. Rather, algorithms have become their own form of political reason. So in that sense, they kind of require us to abandon our preconceptions of what is and is not failure, what is and is not order, and also what is being engineered by and for algorithms to achieve a particular target output. So I think what Louise shows is how algorithms thrive in the interregnum between our normative conceptions of a good life and disruption and disorder. Neil's work on the racialization of disease as being central to the formation of global public health regimes, and also the relationship between the body and the environment to the functioning of empire, I think does incredible work in terms of historicizing some of the problems we're raising here. The focus on disease interventions, animal vivisection, and also interventions in the government of species to secure the national body are detailed in his book, Bioinsecurities, and I think blend with more recent work that he's done on the engineering of Muslim bodies through CIA experiments and torture as a form of counter-terrorist warfare. So as Neil demonstrates, these experiments are based not only on racialized imaginings of culture, but also rely on torture to disrupt bodily systems, a sense of bodily agency and bodily integrity to make prisoners more pliable in interrogations and other forms of physical psychological conditioning. So I think what this work does also is that it demonstrates that these forms of conditioning shape types of surveillance and carceral warfare that seek to proliferate rather than eradicate so-called terrorist bodies. And I see too here the possibility that the experimental ethos of torment and plasticity can exceed the instrumentality of mere information gathering. So I'm very interested and how Neil might think about these experimental practices and disorganizations of the body, and also logics of torture beyond their utility in counterterrorism. Now, Charmaine engages, also her work is really incredible in kind of engaging the derangement of the expansion of just-in-time logistics, and how, in her words, the imperatives for capital expand its circulatory capacities to produce its own irrational rationalities. So I'm very drawn to these descriptions of experiments in geoengineering to expand port capacity in her work, and this aggressive obsession with creating the next biggest container ship and the violent circulations that drive these expansions, as they seem to exceed any kind of rational calculation or durability with regard to climate, to the environment, or even to human suffering. I think one of the things we might discuss is how some readings of Marx might constrain both the rationalities and the irrationality of such experiments to the logic of capital. And this raises questions for me about whether or not capital constrains or merely provokes the horizon of what is pursued experimentally. So as capital goes beyond the global to the interplanetary, in this case, perhaps with plans for Mars colonization, is this merely a kind of return to a sort of expansionist capitalist era of imperialism, or, will this logic of capital mutate under the extraterrestrial conditions of Mars and even beyond? So I think together, all of these interventions speak in different ways to the kinds of habitats, ecologies, and relations that are emerging around uneven injections of disruption and disorder into social and political life. And I'm really looking forward to continuing our discussion in November, on November 5th. Thanks.